Bright Cutie. Every student matters.
So now comes the second order, the nobility. So we are done with the first order, which is the clergy, who were the priests of the Holy Catholic Church. And here we saw how there were bishops who had special privileges, who held land and estates. And then we saw the another category who were monks, how they led a very simple and hard life. And then we saw how there were villages which were now called parish because it was under the control of a priest, and how these sections belong to the category of the first order, that is clergy. And then comes the second order, that is the nobility. So the priests belong to the first order and nobles to the second. So the nobility or the influential class, and they are called influential and powerful because they had the right to control land. They controlled land, and their control was the result of the practice called vassalage. So this practice of vassalage, we know it meant holding something from a superior lord, and it was to the nobles that the king gave his land to. The king was the owner of the entire land in the kingdom. This is the important feature of feudalism, which we have already discussed. And he allotted various amounts of land to his noblemen. So these noblemen were the tenants in chief. And they were vassals of the king. So this vassalage means holding land from a superior lord. And because they held the land from a superior lord, they were called vassals, or the tenant in chief, or the nobility. So the vassals were also called the tenants in chief. And the nobleman accepted the king as his seigneur, that is senior or superior. And this relationship involved many rituals, and exchange of vows were held in the church. And we saw the relationship between the king and the vassal. They had to give military service to the king, and also other kind of personal services were to be provided. And the vassal received a written charter or a staff or even a clod of earth as a symbol of the land that has been given to him by his master. So as a symbol of the receiving of land, the vassal used to get some piece of land, or some sand, or some something which symbolized land, or sometimes a charter, that is a written contract, or a staff which were received by the vassal from the king, and it symbolized the receiving of land from the lord. And the tenants in chief, or king's vassals, let their lands to subtenants. So that's when in the pyramidical order subtenants come after the tenants in chief, and extracted from them practically every right that the king could extract from them. So similar to the services which the tenants in chief had to give the king, the subtenants also had to give the same services to their immediate lords. And this is something which we have already seen as an important feature of feudalism. And this process went on till the land was actually held by actual cultivator. So this is again a repetition of what we have already seen, that it came down to a level where cultivators became the actual owning class, or the holding class. Thus, in between king and cultivators, there were a series of lords and overlords. And that's how it becomes the pyramid. The lord was lord of all people who held land from him and settled in his area. So it was not to one single tenant that the lord gave his land to, because he had a large part of land holding. He gave land to a lot of tenants, and he was the supreme head of all these people who held land from him. So the landlord owned vast tracts of land which contained his own house and his private fields and pastures, the homes and fields of his tenant cultivators. So interestingly, the lord had a large piece of land which held his house. So the house of the lord was called the manor. Manors are very large castles or palace-like buildings which were very magnificent. And it also contained private fields and pastures which was under the control of the lord. And the same place had the homes and fields of cultivators. So the cultivators also lived in that same area with their small houses, and the field on which they worked. So this is how the whole estate of the lord is planned or is located, with a large manor house, then fields and pastures, and then the houses of the tenants and their fields. And the lord's private lands were cultivated by peasants. Interestingly, along with tilling of their own land, the peasants had to serve the lord by working on the field of their lords. And they were expected to fight in the battles as foot soldiers. So, military service was also to be given to the lord. Whenever there was a battle or a fight, the peasants were to be there as foot soldiers of the lord. And in addition to tilling his own land, all these services were to be provided to the lord by the peasant. So the peasant had to cultivate the land of the lord and then also function as a foot soldier. And along with this, he had to cultivate his own land too. So now we look at the manorial estate of the nobility. That is the place where the noble sections, that is second order of the feudal structure, lived. So the manor was a socio-economic unit of a feudal society. So it is a socio-economic unit of a feudal society. The word manor is derived from the word mansion, an abiding place. So the word manor comes from this word mansion, which means a place where the nobles lived. And manor was a cluster of houses on either side of a road. So there were clusters of houses at the either side of the road, some stream or across a valley, and there were water bodies also in these manors, because it was important that the soil in this place remained fertile, which would then yield a lot of productivity. And in the midst of this stood a big house of a lord, and here stood the big house of the lord, which was called the manor house. So this whole area became the manor. So it had clusters of houses where the tenants lived, and then there were large fields. Then there was this very large castle or manorial house in which the lord lived. So the whole geographical region came to be called the manorial estate. And the average population of a manor in 11th and 12th century was nearly 150. So around 150 people lived in a manorial estate in the time period between 11th and 12th century. So this is one of the important socio-economic unit of a feudal society. Like the place where the first order, that is the clergy, lived, which is the monasteries, the nobility lived in manorial estates, and it had great big manor houses. And almost all the things needed for daily use were found on that estate. So it was more or less self-sufficient, that most of the needs of the people within the estate was met within there. And corn was grown in fields. Blacksmith and carpenter manufactured Lord's implements and repaired his weapons. So the manor also had blacksmith and carpenters to meet the needs of the Lord. And we see the stone masons looked after the buildings of the Lord or the nobles. And women spun yarn and wove clothes. So it was the duty of the women to spun yarn and wove clothes. And children worked in Lord's wine presses, that is pressing of grapes and making of wine. Children were also involved in this task. The Lord hunted in the woodlands and estates forests. So the Lord went around and hunted in those big fields which he had. And they had also pastures where Lord's horses and cattle were grazed. Every estate had a church and a castle. So every manorial estate with this population around 150 people had a big church and a castle, obviously the castle where the nobility lived, and another big house for the clergy to reside. The people living in manors were not completely self-sufficient, although to a large extent they were, but they had to obtain salt, millstones, and metalwares from outside sources. So these were some things which the people had to depend on outside sources to procure. The rich landlords brought rich furnishings, musical instruments, and ornaments from other places. Along with these needs which were to be met from outside, we also see the rich landlords or the nobles bought rich furnishing materials, that is furnitures, musical instruments, and other ornaments from outside. So within the noble class or the nobility comes another important category, that is the knights. We have already got introduced this term knight in the initial part of the chapter, but now we'll go into the detail of this category and see how it functioned. So there were frequent localized wars in Europe from 9th century. So when we see that there is already the central structure collapse, or the collapse of the central structure after the death of Charlemagne. So from 9th century onwards, there are battles or wars, localized wars taking place all over Europe. And the untrained peasant soldiers were not sufficient. So even though the peasants or the cultivators were supposed to be foot soldiers of the lords, they were not trained section. Their performance was poor. So there was a need for a good cavalry, that is a trained section of soldiers in the Lord's army. So this increased the importance of a new section of people, the knights.